There's a drive way back. It might be. It could be. It is. Holy cow. Welcome to another broadcast of Bricks Behind the Ivy. Here's your host, Jeff and Sean.
Hey, Cub fans. Welcome back to another episode of Bricks Behind the Ivy. I am your host, Jeff Ragauskas, a.k.a. Candy Cubs. With me, as always, is co-host extraordinaire, Sean Hotstove Cubbies Chapin. Sean, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Your intros get better and better every day, Jeff.
You know, I practice in front of the mirror, and my wife says it's ridiculous, but, you know, it's working for me, so thank you for noticing.
Do you put a heart on the mirror, and then it says, I love Michael Bush?
No, there's a picture of him there, though, and with a heart, and, every day, before, it's like, you know how people do, the play, the champion? That's me, Michael Bush's face, so.
Okay.
Now that we've got the uncomfortable and pleasantries out of the way, if you are watching on video, you've probably noticed that there is another person with us today. Joining us from Bleacher Nation, we have Michael Cerami. Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us today.
You know, I was going to comment that your intro was great. So I agree, Sean. That was pretty good.
Thanks. You know, I took a lot of notes listening to On the Wavelength with Brad all the time, and I felt like he was pretty solid. So it's this must be a thing. So I'm gonna I'm gonna get this really solid. Otherwise, no one's gonna listen, and maybe no one is listening right now. But we're hoping you're listening. So, Mike, we really appreciate you taking some time and hopping on the pod with us to talk about the Cubs. We kind of, when pitching this idea to you, had joked that we're looking at this as the 10% and 10% off the schedule. We're at 18 games now. And we were thinking at the time 16 out of 162, under 10%, 18 out of 162. You know, this is a math pod. We're not going to carry the one. We're not going to do the exact math, but we're around 10%. But before we kind of get into analysis of the team, just kind of give us a little bit of background. How did you become a Cub fan? What led you to Bleacher Nation and writing about the Cubs? And just start there.
Sure, yeah. So I grew up in a family that was all Cubs fans. Like a lot of people, that's, a lot of the same story. But for me, it was my grandma who was a big Cubs fan. She came over from Italy in the 40s and started to learn English by listening to the Cubs play and the announcer on the radio. And so that kind of got passed down. But I would say that wasn't really what the hook was for me. I grew up in a neighborhood that was isolated little neighborhood with 30 houses, but maybe 25 kids within 3 years of me in both directions. And we played baseball constantly. And they were all really big Cubs fans. And so they really got me into it just because my friend group was into it and they were all Cubs fans. And then 1998 happened and Sammy Sosa took over. For those watching, I got a signed Sosa jersey behind me. Took over my life. And but even then I was still kind of young. I was born in 91. So I was still only 7, 8. Those were my first formative Cubs memory years. Then 2003 is really when they sunk their hooks into me, especially probably because they lost and the way they lost. It's that carrot that dangles in front of you and you just wanted it, over and over. And that was the first moment for me where from then on, I knew I was I'm going to be watching all of the games now forever. As for Bleacher Nation, I actually went to school to do nothing close to this. And out of college, I went to U of I. Out of college, I was a consultant for a healthcare software company, and I traveled 100% of the time, Monday through Thursday. But I was a long-time Bleacher Nation reader and commenter and all that, and I saw that Brett, the founder, posted a help wanted ad for people who could write in the weekday evenings. Well, the weekday evenings for me were sitting alone in a hotel room in Connecticut or San Diego or wherever I was, so I had nothing else going on. And so I applied and I interviewed and I sent some samples in and I got a job as a part-time writer for Bleacher Nation, writing about the Cubs. Well, 2015 was a huge year. I really liked what I was doing. I had some other background in business, having worked for a consulting company, and Brett wanted some help. So I joined full-time from there, and I was the first full-time employee at Bleacher Nation. Eventually became sort of a co-partner with Brett, and we kind of just grew from there, where we expanded our Cubs coverage. We then went into Bears, Bulls, Blackhawks, everything we're doing now. So that's sort of how that progression went. It came out of nowhere. I was not a writer. I was a econ and poli sci major in college, so I wrote a ton of papers. That's like what we did. So I did write a lot, but it was not this type of writing, and this was not a dream of mine growing up or anything like that. I was just a huge Cubs fan. Then I saw this opportunity to get off the road and out of these stuffy offices and do something that I actually love and enjoy every day. And that's kind of how I got to where I am now.
That's quite a journey, Michael. I mean, I can kind of relate to your falling in love with the game. You know, my dad and my grandparents listened to Pat and Ron on the radio, and and watched on TV on WGN and stuff. And I was like, I don't know if I really like baseball. But then the '98 home run chase, just Sammy Sosa, and watching Mark McGuire go at it, that was the most awesome point. And then right then I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a huge Cubs fan and dedicated so much to it. So we really appreciate, Jeff and I both do, everything that you guys do at Bleacher Nation.
Yes.
I go to your site more than I probably go to any other site, and that's during the workday. So sorry, work.
No,
But
it's not.
I mean, my lunch period. I do.
Yeah,
I look at it
exactly.
at my lunch period. Kind of going back, or going to this Cubs team. I know it's only 10% into this to the season. What's your overall feel for this Cubs team? What are some of the strengths and weaknesses that you're seeing so far? What has really surprised you about this team?
So here's a topic that I've been sort of wanting to bring up that I think doesn't really get a fair shake. And it's a little nuanced, so it ends up not making it into my writing often. But I see a lot of times people say like, "Oh, what happened to all that depth, starting pitching depth the Cubs are supposed to have?" And it's like,
Mhm.
people lament that as though it's going poorly, when in reality, what would any team do if they lost their ace, their number three, and then Kyle Hendricks,
Right.
whatever position you want to put him in, pitching terribly? This is the depth working, because you have your number 5, Jordan Wicks, your number 6, Javier Assad, your number 7, Ben Brown, all three pitching really well. And then Hayden Wesneski coming up and pitching well as well. So you're already at your 8th starting pitcher on your depth
Yeah.
chart. And the Cubs are 11-7 at the time of recording this. So, like, to me, that is the depth showing. But
Yes.
what was always the concern was not the depth. And again, like, in my mind, it's working and the depth is there. It's that
Mhm.
Justin Steele was the one most irreplaceable player on the team. They do not have another pitcher with his ceiling on the active roster right now, and so losing that is what sort of underscored or highlighted, or whatever you want to say, the starting pitching issues in general. So I would say that their depth has been impressive to me. It's just that no team expects to get tested this significantly this early in the season. And until the Cubs make a decision about what they're going to do with Kyle Hendricks, or if Justin Steele is going to return sooner than we think. I don't think Cade Horton's coming up anytime soon. It's going to be a little bit more of the same. You got to hope that Jamison Tyone comes up and pitches well. And again, by the time the people are listening to this podcast, they will know how Thursday night went against the Marlins.
Yeah.
So hopefully it went really well, and
Yes.
he followed up his strong second half of 2023.
Yeah, I think going into this season, I saw Jamison Tyone as a linchpin on the ceiling of this rotation, just returning to what the expectation was when they signed him. Kind of a innings eater, that 3.5 ERA. They are a little bit higher than that, just giving you a good effort each time out. And I think the wild card there was Imanaga, in just the wide range of what projections had him, and he's been like pretty impressive early on. The Cubs have, I feel like, done a really good job, and I'm hoping it's purposeful, selecting his matchups, getting him out there at Wrigley Field when it's cold, knowing that he's going to
Mhm.
need confidence in that high fastball, and it's less likely to travel when the winds are blowing in April. When in the summer you get that pitch and he doesn't have the confidence to throw it. those are the little things that I feel like, maybe Craig Counsell's bringing to the table, and the minutia and how guys are deployed and putting guys in certain situations to kind of test the waters as they establish this pitching staff, how the bullpen is used. And so we have some information instead of finding three guys that always do it and riding them till they're exhausted, which I mean, I know is the number one criticism on the Twitterverse of old friend David Ross, but also there was not many options he was given. Like, we can't really point the finger at David Ross. That's not there. He had guys that could do it, and there were clearly guys who could not, and they rid every guy that could into the ground to get back into that division. And that is why the team fell apart. They were exhausted. They just didn't have the depth that they were talking and going into. But yeah, I think that's a really good point about this rotation, and also just a highlight of the achievement of this team, given using the depth that they've had to use and still being 4 games above 500 at this point. I think that has to be chalked up as a victory for this development, and for the front office that has received, at times rightfully so, a lot of criticism. So I think like this might be the easiest question for me to answer, but and it's Michael Bush related, much like most of the things out of my mouth on this podcast. But so what is your biggest surprise, maybe beyond Michael Bush? To me, I actually am not horrendously surprised by Michael Bush. I think there was a pedigree there. And I felt like it was a really smart target, that advanced bat, guys blocked in a very good system. Yes, he's not young, but he's definitely not. He's not an older player. Yes, he still qualifies for some of the special, prospect promotions and draft pick compensation the Cubs can get if he gets into certain standings of the Rookie of the Year and things like that, which is great for the Cubs. But yeah, he's been off to a torrid start. The at bats have all looked good. But beyond Michael Bush, who are you watching as someone that's performing a little bit better than expected?
Well, I'd say there's two pretty obvious answers. There's actually a lot. I'm gonna rattle off a few, and you can tell me which one you want to go deeper on. Christopher Morel's defense from week 1 till now has been night and day, and just incredible. I'd say that Nico Horner's approach shift has been interesting to follow. I know he's mentioned that he isn't trying to be more patient or be more selectively aggressive, but I think the data bears out that whether he's doing it on purpose or not, that's what's happening.
True.
I think that Ben Brown's combination of that just elite fastball and knuckle curve is like giving me all kinds of feelings, because he's succeeding with just those 2 pitches. What he can do if he develops a third pitch, likely the changeup, to neutralize lefties, he's going to be absolutely phenomenal. I mean, developing a third big league pitch is not easy, but it doesn't have to be a plus pitch. It just has to be, an offering he can get in there 10% of the time in a game. Throw 8 to 12 of them a game just to keep batters honest. If he could do that, right now he's throwing it like once a game, maybe. You got something really special there, I think. I'd say that Albert Alzolay, I'm going back and forth between like good and bad stuff. Albert Alzolay, sort of not quite being the closer he was in the first half last year is a little concerning. I've definitely seen some issues pop up against lefties again, which he had sort of overcome last year. That's how he sort of rose to prominence, but it seems to be affecting him again. And I'm just trying to think of who else is there. Cody Bellinger, I actually think he looks a little bit better than his numbers have borne out so far. I think he looks okay at the plate. His approach is fine. He has hit a few homers. He's making contact. He's not striking out. He's walking. I think he's going to be okay. And I was definitely concerned about him coming into the year. And then there's okay, here's my actual answer. And I haven't dug into this stuff, and I was finding into it. I know. That's what Jordan Wicks. Jordan Wicks has completely surprised me. He is, as far as I'm concerned, reinvented himself. He is not a guy that's supposed to be throwing 94, 95 miles an hour. He's not a guy that's supposed to be getting whiffs. He's not a guy that's supposed to be getting as many strikeouts as he has. And all of that is leading me to believe, a few more starts, and we have to like seriously reconsider what his ceiling is. And it's not like that changes anything, but in my mind, he was a a perfectly good number 4, number 5 guy. And that's an awesome guy to have on a minor or major league minimum contract. Young, can eat innings, whatever. It's looking like he can be a lot more than that, and that has been by far the biggest surprise to me of the year.
Yeah, I think
I think that's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just going to talk over you, Jeff. Okay.
No, it's totally fine.
No.
I think, yeah, I mean, we can get back into digging into Wicks because I think that's a really interesting topic. But yeah, I think he was sold to us as like Kyle Hendricks from the left side. Like this guy's
Mhm.
gonna have
Exactly.
a good changeup, and I mean, you had me at Kyle Hendricks. Like been watching this guy develop and been really interested what he could do. I believe he was an older college pitcher at like Kansas State when he was
Yeah.
drafted, and figured the timeline there for based on the age was pretty short, or expected to be short, and he'd be in the majors, and here we are. But yeah, the velocity has been there, and yeah, he has been the most whiffs in every start he's been at. He's led the game in whiffs by a pitcher.
Mhm.
He's been getting a lot of swing and miss. That fastball's played really well. I would love to see length. I think that's like the next step is like finding a happy medium of when to pitch, because I don't know if it feels like he's chasing the strikeout, but he's getting strikeouts. So like that's great. But yeah, I'd like to get him to the 6th inning. Like I think that would be kind of the next step. But especially the one
Yeah.
that impressed me the most was that Dodgers start. Like that's not for a young guy who's kind of reestablishing his stuff in the majors, going against that lineup. And I know he's on the left side and there's some strong lefties in there, so a little bit of a platoon advantage theoretically, but he looked great. And yes, he didn't get long in that game, but to go through that lineup like he did and limit the damage and get as many whiffs as he did versus players like that was like, all right, hold on, let's pin this. Maybe this is something.
Yeah, well, and when the lefties are Freddie Freeman and Shohei Ohtani,
Yes.
they don't count. They don't count.
Yeah.
They don't
exactly count as lefties.
Yeah.
But I would agree that length is something to look for next. But I would also say that if the situation wasn't ideal for him to come out yesterday, he might have gone 6th inning. He left the game with 1 out in the 5th at 74 pitches. And the only reason that he was pulled was because there was a pocket of righties coming up and Hayden Wesneski was available and on a starter schedule ready to throw 4 innings. If all of those things didn't line up, it's very likely that Wicks, maybe he gives up a run, maybe he gets out of the inning, but he's heading into the 6th inning at 75 to 80 pitches. And then maybe or the 5th inning, or no, 6th inning, right? And maybe he gets another inning and then he gets a 6th inning start right there. Right? You know what I mean? Like he was actually pretty efficient for how many strikeouts. I think he had 5 and 9 whiffs that he was getting yesterday. And so we were almost robbed of that, but in service of winning the game, which was absolutely the correct decision at the time. So that was circumstantial, but I do think we were about to see a little bit more efficient start from him there.
Yeah, and I just think that, that elusive 6th inning for the Cubs starting rotation, that's eventually going to break through for most of the pitchers on the staff. But, for the most part, Craig Counsell has played his hand pretty well with managing the bullpen and the rotation. And I give him a lot of credit to giving Kyle some slack. I know it doesn't always play out well, in the box score, but you got to give that guy a little bit of slack. I mean, he's the last member of the 2016 team. He's a great teammate. You can't give up on him now. So I kind of wanted to touch on that a little bit with Kyle Hendricks. How long do you see him, if he continues to perform the way he is performing? Do you see him getting a shorter leash, a longer leash? How long do you think until they're like, we can't go forward with him in the rotation any longer?
Yeah, so this is going to be a tough one to answer because it's entirely possible that, for all we know, Jameson Taillon's return is going to be paired with a Hendricks IL stint or something.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't think that's what's going to happen. It doesn't sound like that's what Tommy Hottovy said. But he said, we think he's going to work his way out of it. And I will say that the one saving grace for Hendricks is, aside from the fact that he's smart and a hard worker and maybe he just gets himself out of it, and he's pitched against three really tough teams, or four, is that he actually still has like shockingly good like underlying metrics, like his average exit velocity, his ground ball rate, his barrel rate. They're all good. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that
Vindication. Sorry.
it doesn't. But I'm not, and I'm the number one person to like be like, listen, those stats will bear fruit, right? Like, I don't think that's necessarily the case because by categorically, Kyle Hendricks was already the type of pitcher for whom the margin of error was thin, and he was just so good at staying on top of his game that it didn't often play out to the negative. If he's not on top of his game, that margin for error that was already really thin becomes razor thin, and then you see what happens. It's like this is the risk inherent in this sort of pitcher, so you can't lean on the advanced metrics quite as much as you would for some other pitcher who's got other things going for him, because Kyle Hendricks doesn't have those other things going for him. If his command isn't pristine, if the defense isn't perfect right now, and if he's not getting as much movement or separation on his pitches as he usually does, then this is what's going to happen. There's going to be ball in play after ball and play after ball and play. And we've seen how that can work out against him. And that's not bad luck when it's the type of pitcher you are. So I'm not sure how much longer they'll give him. I know I will say this, if he's not the roster move that has already happened by the time everyone who's listening to this is listening to it, there's no way he can go if he makes another start and gives up 7 earned runs, well, you can't start him again. You need to do the injured list thing. But the big problem here is that it stinks for all the obvious reasons that he's not succeeding, but especially because had he been pitching well, just like a number 5, just like eating 5 innings and allowing 3 or 4 runs, so not a great ERA, but pitching well, then you can move Ben Brown, who is not going to make 150 innings this year. It's not going to happen by any stretch. The Cubs won't let that happen. Well, you can move him into the bullpen where he would be dominant for multiple innings at a time. He has the ideal bullpen combination of pitches right now. You could have moved Javier Assad into the bullpen, who has excellent relief appearances on his resume, in addition to being good in the rotation. And that would then kill 2 birds with 1 stone. When Steele and Tyon come back, you get two more guys in the rotation that are better theoretically than your 6th and 7th starter, and 2 guys in the bullpen that are certainly better than your 7th and 8th reliever. But Kyle Hendricks doesn't make any sense in the bullpen. That is not going to be where this ends up. It just doesn't make sense. So he's either going to be in the rotation or he's going to be on the injured list. I don't see any other version of it. And that's a bummer because, again, the Cubs could have killed 2 birds with 1 stone by moving Brown or Assad into the bullpen when Tyon came back.
Yeah, I think, this is a Kyle Hendricks pod. It's clear as day. His jersey is autographed and hanging on the wall right behind me. My son is named after Kyle Hendricks. And the only reason I'm saying that is I want you to gently tell me I'm wrong when I ask you this question. But I've been looking at the underlying metrics a lot because I'm a fan and trying to be more analytical when it comes to the game and trying not to let the heart lead the brain. But there is some interesting things in regards to his velocity and horizontal movement on his pitches that are not significantly, but higher than career norms, higher than last year. And I keep thinking about just the capsular issue going into last year and what we thought Kyle Hendricks was going to be. Like, do you see that as an indicator of like maybe additional strength, or is that an indicator of sloppy mechanics? Like, it just feels weird that there is additional movement and still solid and better velocity that I think would lead to success. But like when he bleeds into the zone, exactly what you said, like that's not something he can do. Like having that extra movement might be what is challenging him, or it's an indicator of him pushing beyond something that might be bothering him. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that there's any traction there on a process?
Well, I'd say this is what you're describing is sort of touches on what I mentioned, but it also really brings to life what's so perplexing about his struggles is that in 2022 it was a lot easier to see what was going on. He started losing velocity, and when he
Mhm.
lost velocity and command, the gap between his fastball and his changeup shrunk, and the effectiveness of that changeup went away. So they shut him down early. He spent the offseason and the early part of the season building up his arm strength, came back throwing harder than ever, which again has persisted through this year. And he had a ton of success last season. Like,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
feel like people are like so quick to be like, he's washed. It's like, well,
No.
maybe, but do you not remember that he just made 24 excellent starts
Yeah.
last year? Like, if 2022 led right into this, yeah, okay,
Correct.
he's washed.
Totally
He's 34
understand.
and
100%. Yeah.
but
Yep.
that's not what happened. So we
No.
have to be a little bit more suspect of it. And if there's any pitcher, so again, if everything's physically feeling all right, which it appears to be based on his velocity, then you do want to give him a chance to work his way out of it. But I would contend that a Wrigley Field start against the Miami Marlins, who are one of the worst teams in baseball and are not particularly strong against right-handed pitchers, is like a pretty good, well, let's see what you got
Yeah.
then kind of moment. You know what I mean? Because I have at times throughout my career, I had swung too far in the direction of ignoring the actual results. Like, I'm an advanced analytics guy, I'm a stats guy, I like the numbers and I trust them. But this is also like there's a lot to this game that you just have to see. And right now, Kyle Hendricks is getting rocked. He's getting absolutely torched. You can't just like hand wave it away because of this metric or that metric. I mean, those things are part of the conversation and they can help balance us out. And it's why I'm not here today to say he's absolutely cooked. If he didn't have all of those other things going for him, I would, but he does. So it's a balance, and it's like, let's see, okay, but at a certain point, you do need to get results, or there is somebody else that we need to at least try. But again, like I said just a few moments ago, I'm willing to let him keep going because if there's anybody that can work their way out of it while feeling good, it's him. He'll identify
For
what
sure.
is wrong and he'll be able to execute a game plan better than honestly almost any pitcher in baseball, probably. But on top of that, he doesn't make sense anywhere but the rotation. So you have to try. And then when that is no longer an option, okay, well, you see where you're at. But I'm sure he's a team player and would accept a sort of phantom IL stint, so to speak. But the Cubs are not exactly in a position to just be casting aside starters. And it's not like they have a
No.
lot of other options. They just signed Julio Teheran because they didn't have anybody else to backfill in Iowa. I mean, like,
Yeah.
what are we talking about here? You can't just go, well, get rid of him. I mean, the bullpen is struggling too. So it's a more complicated conversation. And I think anyone that tries to simplify it by saying he's washed, it's over, is just ignoring a lot of context.
Agreed.
And so that's why we have to see. But again, Marlins at home, this is going to be a big one, unfortunately, and it doesn't mean that he's going to be released the next day, but because he won't. But it's going to be a conversation forming start, I think, and at that point, there's not going to be any stat that can protect him from a change that needs to be made. And I love Kyle Hendricks. I mean, he is the man. One of my favorite Cubs of all time, and deserves all of the slack and leash that any player you can ever give. Because you have to be cold and you have to be smart and you have to make the right decisions, but also this is an entertainment sport, and I literally feel love for Kyle Hendricks. So, like,
Yeah.
like, can we honor anybody? Like, then it's him,
Right.
right? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think there's some hypersensitivity to that thought process too, just like how the 2016 team kind of like just disintegrated. And obviously there's a multitude of factors of like financial components and how the players progressed, how they didn't progress, and all those things. Like it's not a black and white story, but like when you're talking about the team that did the thing that we all waited to see, and just thinking about like the fire pit bandwagon going down the mountain into a bowl of dynamite. Like it's just like it feels like it doesn't feel like what they deserve for what they did. Like just even saying Joe Madden in a baseball conversation brings different feelings for people now than like the guy was a god. Like he was a shot and a beer for
Yeah.
everyone here. Like just the Guinness
Mhm.
can and all that, and the shirts with the glasses. Like it was so different. Like this is not the time or the place to like have that rehire. It's just, but like Kyle Hendricks is the last player from that team, and yeah, and like he started Game 6 in the LCS. He started Game 7 in the World Series. So like a lot of attachment there. I feel the same literal love for the human being. I named my kid for Christ's sake after him. Like
Mhm.
my son's a World Series baby, and yeah, like watching him pitch in an era of high velocity is been special. Like just watch like him outsmart lineups like with what he has, and that is just the next wave in baseball is like what he can do is trying to figure out how to teach it. And I don't know if that's like some biometrics or how they're going to figure that out because as this elbow epidemic continues, is like people are paid for spin and velocity and how much can that arm really take as we continue to like exceed what we thought the potential of like the highest velocity of a fastball and such was. There's going to be a course correction of like, well, can we teach people command? And no one has ever been able to crack that code, and it's why we've moved the velocity, because like it doesn't matter
Yep.
where it is if you can't see it. Like so that's
Mm.
yeah, it'll be
Yeah.
interesting to see how that goes. Yeah, I guess like as the 2024 season has gone on, I think that we all thought there were different strengths of this team going into the season, maybe some things that we wish they addressed differently. So, how do you feel? Like, what do you think the Cubs' biggest strength right now? And I do want to kind of point out we had Cardinals underscore live on first season preview, and he said this about the Cubs. We asked every person we had from the NL Central on what they thought of the Cubs, and he said something to me that I feel like rings weirdly true. That the Cubs roster is designed to not be really, really good at anything, but they're not bad at anything either. Like you're gonna have to be really hot to beat them, was his perspective, because they're not gonna have cold stretches because their floor is really, really solid. So that being said, what are your thoughts of what the Cubs' biggest strength is at this point in the season?
Yeah. I don't want to duck the question, but you bring up something that I say a lot, and it's that the Cubs roster is like the most loaded with good players, but no elite players, like of any roster I've ever seen. Like truly around the diamond, it is like you're like, let's actually do it for just like a second. Ian Happ has been an all-star and has 2 Gold Gloves for left field. You can think what you want, but he's the best
Yeah,
of the defenders in that spot.
Yeah.
And he gets on base, right? Good player. Absolutely the
Yeah.
type of player that can be on a World Series team. Cody Bellinger's in center field. We all know what he's capable of and what he can do. His defense is excellent there, and he is an offensive force when he's feeling healthy, which for the most part he is. Right field, Seiya Suzuki is basically the Cubs' best hitter. Increasingly consistent and increasingly consistent at a much higher level than when he first broke into the league and there was more ups and downs. Easily a type of player that can be on a World Series team. Third base is where you have a question mark, but that question mark is a guy who has the potential to be one of the most feared power hitters in baseball, and his defense is improving every day.
Mhm.
He's young. He's the type of player that you'd be like, well, I definitely want to gamble on him being good. Shortstop, Dansby Swanson. Does anybody make every 95% play more than him? I mean, no, he's incredible. There's more flashy defensive center fielders, shortstops out there, but nobody, in my opinion, in baseball makes the routine play as well as he does. Nico Horner is not a star, but he is a Gold Glove second baseman with plenty of ability, makes good contact, and he's still growing and is young. At first base, you have Michael Bush, who's apparently the most amazing player in baseball.
Yes.
And obviously, he's a top 50 prospect, a guy you want to give run there. Behind the plate, you have Yan Gomes and Miguel Amaya. Nothing special, but they have a young guy who's a good hitter and an old guy who's smart and knows how to handle a pitching staff. So it just right. And at DH, you have a vacancy, right? And it's the bench, and that's how the Cubs are using it this year. So right away, not talking about any of their prospects or anything else, you go, those are good players at every position. Not one of those players, not even one, is a superstar. They do not have a superstar on the roster anywhere. But to your point, that is not a team that is going to go into very deep valleys. They might not have steep peaks either because they lack that sort of player. But that's sort of what this Jed Hoyer era is about. It's like minimizing risk and raising the floor. I think they still need a superstar player, and it would
Yes,
have to
I
come at the
agree.
expense of. I think it's a necessity. Whether that's a hitter like Juan Soto or some ace that you could bring in to slot everyone down a spot.
Mike Trout. Mike Trout.
Trade for Mike Trout. I would do it.
Yeah.
And you could do the same thing with the pitching staff. But I would guess I would say then that their strength is that they don't have weaknesses. It's just that they do not have a star player, and that is a glaring hole. Long term, it likely leads to routinely winning the NL Central, and then the playoffs are a crapshoot because it's baseball, and the
Yeah.
Diamondbacks made it to the World Series. But until they get that superstar player, that's what I'm going to be saying that they're lacking the most. It's just that their strength is that, boy, there's a lot of them. It's almost like a mirror image discussion of what I was saying about the depth in the rotation at the start of this
Sure.
podcast. It's like there's you could go 8 deep and be like, yeah, I want to see this guy start. We're not start like I feel like people forget like a regular rotation, they're number 5, let alone they're 6, 7, or 8, are guys where you're like, oh my God, he's starting today. Like, seriously.
Yeah.
That is Ben Brown right now. I mean, I guess it's Kyle Hendricks, but that's
Yeah,
only
that
because of how it
wasn't the
has
plan.
gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like, that is incredible. It's just that there's no ace. There's no ace on the roster. Justin Steele like can be, but I think we all know he's not quite at that tip top elite top 5 pitcher in baseball tier. He's a very, very, very good pitcher, and in a tier of his own on the Cubs. But so that's what they're missing. But it's also their strength. So it's a very strange team. It feels very Jed Hoyer-y to set his team up that way, frankly, because mitigating risks seems to be like one of his calling cards, or one of the things that calls to him.
Sure.
One of the things that I see really elevating this roster is the Craig Counsell effect, is how we refer to it. What's your feeling on Craig Counsell so far? I know we're only 10% into the season, but a lot of folks have some opinions, especially on X. What's your feeling of him so far? Those thoughts, things that possibly he could do better, or things that you really like seeing from him as a manager?
Sure. So I'll say a couple things. One of the things I really liked, what I really like, and I think will keep going until, ideally Pete Crow Armstrong starts hitting in Iowa, gets called up, pushes Bellinger to first base, and Michael Busch to DH or whatever, is how he's used the DH role. He's been really aggressive in subbing out Happ and Suzuki and Bellinger, and utilizing half day offs to get people rest. And it's one of those things that you might not know how much of an impact it had until you get to the end of the season and you go like, wow, Ian Happ started 158 games. How did that happen? Well, because he started 20 games at DH instead of 5, or whatever it ends up being. And I think he's really used that well. I think the last couple days of pitching and bullpen management, even when it's gone wrong, it really underscores a contextual understanding of the season as a whole. So, for example, Jordan Wicks is cruising. It would be great, theoretically, to have him keep pitching longer. You save the bullpen even further, which is already, getting a lot of overuse and struggling because of that. But he pulls him because he has Wisniewski available and lets Wisniewski go his 4 innings. But the day prior, I think it was the day prior, it might have been 2 days earlier, he left Kyle Hendricks out for, what people would say is an extra inning. And it's like, well, no, when that game got to extra innings, you already had Drew Smyly coming back in after pitching 26 pitches the day before. So can you imagine where they would have been had they not left Hendricks in? And so it's like, I think he's making the sort of decisions that are like, that may seem odd, but are like, no, when you actually take 1 second to look at the bigger picture, it's actually the exact right decision, not just for today's game, but for the season as a whole, unless in that moment that game mattered more. And in my opinion, winning yesterday's game against the Diamondbacks at the end of this sort of up and down road trip out west, where they had lost a couple of games that they should have won, winning that game before you get home to a nice, theoretically, hopefully sweet series at Wrigley, 4 against the Marlins, and then an off day. Winning that game and bringing your road trip to 5-4 instead of 4-5 was like hugely important for momentum. So
Yeah.
not only did it matter, not only was it the right move circumstantially, but like in the broader context of like how important it would be to make sure that we get out of this inning without Wicks giving up more runs, and so we can go on to win this game. That was important. That was a huge move. So he seems to have a good sense of the big picture, which we knew he would, and I do think on a even on a granular level, his use of the DH spot has been inspired, and not just sticking Garrett Cooper there every day, or just sticking Mike Tauchman there every day, or just sticking Nick Magical there every day, which would have been easy and fine and justifiable. It was the right thing to do, and hopefully it ends up playing out at the end of the season.
Yeah, I think I've been really impressed with different decisions he's made in exactly the same context. He's had like the bullpen management, how he's deployed different things, early use of the DH for like quasi rest days. I've really enjoyed that, especially with last year's, kind of in collapse, obviously down the stretch. Like it feels like getting some of these guys a rest here and there, but still keeping them in the lineup, understanding what they bring to the lineup has been really strong. So I think going into the season, there is, I think there is some debate on it being kind of a leveled offseason, meaning they kind of got back to where they were. They got Bellinger back. They didn't make extremely, extremely splashy moves in addressing the roster. They bring really, for me, going into the 2024 or for the 2024 season, they needed to get major league average production at first and third base because that was just something that was not happening a good portion of last year. And that would, to me, raise the floor. And I think, we had delusions of grandeur and with some of the free agents and whether or not people were going to, Toronto or whatever the hell was going on this offseason, that like the Cubs were in these conversations for, you wish like in a trade conversation for Soto, or like had really been negotiating really hard with Shohei Ohtani, and something I wouldn't bet on now, cue the symbols. But ultimately, they are what they are. Do you think this team, based on how they've started the season, have raised your expectations of what they can do this year, or are they kind of still where you thought they were?
Oh no, I think they've absolutely raised my expectations. Let's talk about it two ways. So one, they've withstood losing their ace, their number 3, their third most important reliever, and now the right fielder, and they're 11-7. So 11-7 is a good record, and it's come against some really good teams. So that is a good sign, and it's a good cushion to start the year. But more importantly, if you look at the Cubs' schedule, and it stays hard for another month and a half, 2 months, but the second half is a lot lighter than the first half. And so if they got through May, or at 500, I'd be feeling great because of what was ahead of them still. If they are ahead there, well, then they're sitting even prettier. And the flip side would be true. If they had an easier schedule to start the year, they would necessarily have to be winning a lot more games than they are, maybe being 11-7. So like, I actually think they're in a better spot because of what's coming and because of what they've already done. I also think here's the thing: is like, let's say they get to the trade deadline and they're in the race still. Jed Hoyer is for as not active as he is in the offseason. He's actually a really active trade deadline GM or president, and I feel like he makes a lot of moves in one direction to the other every year. One of the easiest things to acquire ever just so happens to align at the deadline, happens to align with the Cubs' greatest need, which is help in the bullpen, back into the bullpen.
Yeah.
And they have the number 1 or number 2, depending on which publication you're looking at, minor league system in baseball. They can acquire anybody they want. More importantly, where they are in their overall organizational competitive cycle leads me to believe that if there were that one player that is unexpectedly available, a young star who's got 3 years of control remaining and is going to be available at the deadline. It happens. We've seen it happen in the past.
Sure.
The Cubs are one of the teams that could actually probably take advantage of that because they would not only need him this year, but in the future as well. And so I do think that one way or another, they're going to get even better at the deadline and then play a lot of bad teams in the second half. A lot of teams that probably would have already sold off at the deadline, making themselves even worse. So the fact that they're above 500 now, dealing with all these injuries, is a really good sign. You get some of these guys back, you keep your head at or above water for another month. Then you start looking at July and what you can add to your team and how you can really make a run in the second half of the season. So I feel better about the Cubs today than or let me put it to this way. If you were to have told me before the season started, would you take 11-7 on April 18th, lock it in, or do you want to roll the dice? I'd lock it in immediately, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there you go. That answers your question. They're better than we would have than you would have hoped. Because if you would say, what if it was 7-11, you would say, well, no, let's see if they can beat that. If it's
right.
8-10, 9-11, you know what I mean? 9-9.
Yeah.
You start to get 11-7. Take it, lock it in. Absolutely not expecting them to do that well.
Michael, I really like when you say stuff that I have communicated on X and on this podcast. It makes me feel really validated and feel good about myself, because I think you touched on a great point. If this team is in the hunt at the trade deadline, it just seems like it's setting up really, really well for them. And you're right, Jed is pretty active at the deadline, and I think being in that position, facing that schedule at the second half, it lines up perfectly. And I would have taken 11-7 in a heartbeat, because I had them 9-9, and I felt like I was being optimistic at this point. So I think you made a lot of good points, mainly because you said a lot of things that I have said, and we agree on things. So thank you for that.
Yeah, that's what I'm here for. I'm actually just reading your tweets. People that
No, it's got to be the other way around, Michael. It's got to be the other way around. I see some, I'm like, I'm gonna just make that my own.
It's a nice ego boost. I'm gonna need to ask my wife for another wing in my Cub cave so I can store my ego after this episode. But yeah, Mike, we want to thank you so much for hopping on the pod today and talking Cubs. And for those who are listening or watching, just a real plug of where people can find your writings and your tweets if they're looking for it.
Sure. So BleacherNation.com is where you can find all the stuff I write. Follow us on Twitter, also at BleacherNation, or you can follow me on Twitter at Michael_Cerami, which is Cerami. It's like ceramic, but without the last C. And please do follow me and interact, because I really love the Cubs, broader online fan base when it's not the comment section under one of my articles or Facebook. Then it's really fun.
So true.
It's great. No, but really, guys like you and the entire, there's a lot of great Cubs podcasters and writers and content creators out there, and everyone is so nice and so awesome. So thank you for having me on your show. I love talking Cubs, and I'm happy to do it anytime. So I really appreciate it.
We're definitely going to hold you to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this has been another episode. This has been another episode of Bricks Behind the Ivy, a Cub podcast for Cub fans by Cub fans. I once again am Jeff Rogowskis and a Cubs. With me, as always, is co-host extraordinaire Sean Chapin. Sean, any last thoughts before we let the nice people go?
I just want to thank Michael again, and I'm on Bleacher Nation as we speak.
There we go. That's I feel like that's the inception moment of being inside the website with the website. And great movie, by the way. But anyway, thanks again for listening. We'll catch you guys next week.
Well, that's going to do it from here, from Bricks Behind the Ivy. This is Harry Carey. We know you've enjoyed the broadcast and the outcome. Be sure to share, like, and subscribe to this wonderful broadcast that they've done and the podcast going forward. Be sure to also check us out on YouTube and Instagram and whatever else is out there on the airwave. And we want to thank Jeff and Sean for putting this all together and keeping us all Cub fan entertained with their knowledge. You know, I also love to always say that Jeff's last name spelled backwards is Sick as Cigar. And Sean's is Nipak. My oh my, it never gets old. Well, that's gonna do it from here. So from all of us here at Bricks Behind the Ivy, this is Harry Carey saying, go Cubs, holy cow, and so long, everybody.